The restaurant shimmered with gold light and quiet power, a sanctuary where billion-dollar conversations hid behind soft music and polished marble. Khalid Rahman sat at the head of a private table framed by velvet curtains, his presence calm but commanding, the kind of man who had signed contracts on 3 continents and never once doubted his instincts. His tailored navy suit rested perfectly on his shoulders, and the silver in his beard gave him an air of authority that made younger entrepreneurs lower their voices around him. Tonight was meant to be historic, a $200 million partnership that would expand his real estate empire into emerging coastal territories, transforming untouched land into futuristic commercial hubs. Across from him sat 2 sharply dressed investors, charismatic and confident, their smiles smooth as the wine they poured into crystal glasses. They spoke of rapid permits, exclusive rights, government connections, and guaranteed returns that sounded almost too perfect. Khalid had reviewed the documents earlier with his legal team. Everything appeared legitimate, stamped, sealed, professionally bound. The projections were ambitious but believable. He felt the thrill of expansion rising in his chest, that familiar rush of standing at the edge of something enormous. Moving quietly around the room was Layla, a waitress trained to blend into the background. She carried herself with practiced grace, refilling glasses, clearing plates, offering polite nods. No one noticed how observant her eyes were or how carefully she listened. Raised in a multilingual household, she had grown up shifting between dialects of Arabic as easily as changing tone, often translating business calls for her father when he struggled with formal phrasing. As she approached the private table to replace an empty bottle of sparkling water, the conversation shifted subtly. One of the investors leaned slightly toward the other, lowering his voice and switching into Arabic, assuming privacy within a foreign country where few understood the language fluently. Layla's hands stilled for half a second as she caught the words. "He's ready," the man murmured. "Once he signs, the transfer hits offshore accounts. By the time anyone checks the land registry, we'll be gone." The other suppressed a chuckle. $200 million for forged permits. He'll never know until it's too late. A chill ran down Layla's spine. She kept her expression neutral, placing the bottle gently on the table, but her pulse thundered in her ears. She glanced at Khalid, who was listening attentively as the men returned to English, praising his vision and calling him a pioneer. He looked proud, energized, unaware that the deal being presented was a carefully constructed illusion. Layla stepped back, her mind racing. This was not her place. Wealthy men negotiated risks every day. Perhaps she had misunderstood. But she hadn't. The words were clear: forged permits, offshore accounts, disappearance. She thought about what $200 million meant. Not just numbers on a screen, but employees, families, projects, reputations. She imagined the headlines, the lawsuits, the collapse of trust. Her breath grew shallow. Intervening could cost her everything. The investors looked powerful, dangerous even. A waitress accusing them of fraud would be dismissed instantly, or punished quietly. At the table, one investor slid the contract folder closer to Khalid. "Shall we make history tonight?" he asked warmly. The pen was placed beside the final signature line, the ink dark and ready. Khalid lifted it with steady fingers, confidence radiating from him. Layla felt time slow, the air thickening as if the entire room sensed what was about to happen. She remembered her father once saying that silence in the face of dishonesty makes you part of the lie. Before fear could anchor her feet to the marble floor, she stepped forward under the pretense of adjusting a misplaced fork. Leaning slightly closer to Khalid, her voice barely audible above the music, she whispered a single word in Arabic, a word sharp enough to cut through illusion. "Lie." The word lingered in Khalid's mind like the sudden crack of thunder before a storm, sharp and impossible to ignore. His hand froze inches above the contract, the expensive pen suspended between fortune and disaster. For a fraction of a second, he questioned whether he had truly heard it, but the urgency in the waitress's whisper had been unmistakable. He slowly lowered the pen onto the polished table and leaned back in his chair, studying the 2 investors with a gaze that had negotiated oil rights, shipping empires, and international mergers. Something subtle had shifted. The confidence in their posture now seemed rehearsed, their smiles slightly strained at the edges. Switching deliberately into Arabic, Khalid's voice became calm but piercing. He asked them to clarify the municipal authorization codes attached to the coastal permits. One man blinked, then responded in careful formal Arabic, but his answer was vague. Khalid followed with another question, about the specific department head who had signed the approval and the internal registration sequence required for foreign-backed development projects. A flicker of panic crossed their faces before they masked it with forced laughter. They attempted to steer the conversation back to projected profits and market timing, but Khalid no longer listened to promises. He listened to hesitation. Within minutes, he signaled discreetly to his legal advisor seated near the end of the table. The advisor began verifying permit numbers through secure government databases, fingers moving swiftly across a tablet screen. The room grew quieter, the earlier warmth replaced by a cold tension that pressed against the walls. Layla watched from a distance, her heart pounding so loudly she feared it might draw attention. The investors exchanged a glance, brief, loaded, nervous. One reached for his phone, pretending to check a message, while the other wiped a thin layer of sweat from his temple. Then the confirmation arrived. The registration numbers belonged to unrelated agricultural land filed years earlier. The official seals had been digitally copied from archived documents. The signature of the supposed department head did not match any active government record. The permits were elaborate fabrications. Khalid's expression did not erupt in anger. Instead, it hardened into something far more intimidating, controlled clarity. He closed the contract folder gently, as though sealing away the illusion it contained. In measured Arabic, he thanked the men for revealing themselves before irreversible damage had been done. Security personnel, already alerted by the subtle tension in the room, approached the table with professional composure. The investors' polished demeanor shattered into desperate excuses. They claimed clerical errors, blamed assistants, insisted on misunderstandings. But their earlier arrogance had vanished, replaced by fear. Guests in nearby sections pretended not to notice as the two men were escorted out, their unfinished wine glasses left behind as silent evidence of their failed deception. When the doors finally closed and the restaurant's quiet elegance returned, Khalid remained seated for a long moment, staring at the space where his signature would have been. $200 million nearly transferred into nothingness. Years of work, reputation, trust, almost compromised by a convincing performance. He exhaled slowly, gratitude mixing with disbelief. Rising from his chair, he asked the manager to bring the waitress who had been serving the table. Layla approached cautiously, bracing herself for consequences she could not predict. Instead, Khalid addressed her in Arabic, his tone steady but filled with respect. He asked how she understood the conversation. She explained simply that Arabic was her first language and that she could not remain silent after hearing the truth. There was no dramatic speech, no demand for reward, only quiet sincerity. Khalid nodded, recognizing that the rarest asset in any empire is not capital, but integrity. In the weeks that followed, authorities uncovered a wider network of fraudulent deals connected to the same men, preventing other investors from suffering devastating losses. Khalid ensured that Layla's courage did not go unnoticed. He offered her a position within his company's compliance and risk assessment division, valuing her attentiveness and moral clarity more than any resumed credential. What began as a whisper in a crowded dining room transformed into a turning point for them both. Khalid gained more than financial security that night. He gained a renewed understanding that vigilance must stand beside ambition. And Layla learned that even the quietest voice, when guided by honesty, can redirect the course of millions.